Okay, so let's look here now. I went ahead and did some spaced out rows of split back stitch. And again, before I go forward, I notice how the stitch pulls the cloth. And in a long strip like this, I get kind of a ripple in between. I don't see these things as tension issues. I see them as potentials for creating texture. So I really like how it's repeating the pattern, and at the same time it's also created this kind of ripple. And you know, when you notice those things, you realize that you can control them if you go slow enough. And if you start to get a real pull in the cloth, you could balance it out with some other kind of stitch elsewhere. Okay, let's look at this section here. This is something that I do very often, and I know a lot of people confuse it with the wrap stitch. What I'm actually doing, and I don't normally draw lines, but since they're here, is I'm doing a stacked running stitch. Or you could call it a stacked cantha stitch as well. And this is just a way to, what is that? To place your running stitch very close together and allow it to form a bar. Now this uses a lot of thread, but it's a very simple way to stitch and get these bar-like configurations. And you can also notice that just like any running stitch or quilting stitch, if you do it fairly coarsely and not in a hoop or anything, you get this additional raising up, which is the result of the distortion that happens that I've talked about over here. But in a running stitch, the stitch as it goes across pulls the fabric in slightly. So you just have to be a little bit careful, because if you pull really tightly, well, of course, if you want to distort, that's fine. But you can have, especially in a meditative sense like this, you can really have a very slow control about how much you pull the stitch. I'd like to just give it a little tug to encourage that ridge a little bit. And especially if you use the stab method, which is much slower, you can keep your fingers pinched from below and above and hold on and keep the thread from pulling too much in this direction. So you have a lot of control if you work slowly, and it gives you a beautiful ridged look. And when you get to the edge of each row, you want to come back up right next to that stitch and be careful that you don't pull it out by coming back up. You have to leave a little bit of fabric there. So I usually stitch laterally like this in one direction and come back with the stab method in the second direction, so that I can keep control over how much I pull the fabric. So this is a way to use a lot of running stitch and get a beautiful texture and an interesting type of patterning. I mean, I really like to show how different it actually looks from the wrap stitch when you put them next to each other. I mean, these are the reasons that I like to do these different types of stitches, and so much of them, next to one another, so I can really learn about which stitch I might want to use in the future. You know, I've used this stitch on the windrobe. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it really gives a nice kind of a woven feel. And because it's a running stitch, it's also pretty much a quilting stitch. So it's a nice way to hold layers together as well. And you can see here I've actually mixed it in with some patching, and in this case to hold the woven web together, and just use it as a form of quilting for some of the squares. So this is a great stitch. Takes a little while, but the texture is really wonderful. And because there's a space here, it gives the fabric more of a drape than a solid wrap stitch.